moving on, in summation of all three casting reports I just made, that there's 7 actors, most of them on the small council. What do these small council castings tell us about the time frame that is going to be covered by season 1? Will it end with Viserys' death and the outbreak of the Civil War, or might that happen near the end of season 2? Because there was turnover on his small council, and some of the people who were on the small council in the last years of his reign and at the point he died, they haven't been announced yet. And it's a question of, will they announce them, or they haven't been announced because they don't appear yet? Well, because Viserys reigned almost 30 years, his small council can be broadly divided into 2 phases, early and late, which makes sense that we have seen a set of younger actors cast for earlier scenes. That there's young Rhaenyra played by Millie Alcock, there's young Alicent played by Emily Carey, and in the spy photos we had of them, we even saw them sharing a scene with Graham McTavish, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, in the early phase of her father's reign. Minor spoilers here. I'm not going to say murder plots and stuff, but because her father reigned almost 30 years, people who were old men at the beginning of his reign die of old age by the late phase. That's not a shocking cliffhanger or anything. I'm just going to mention some of these people die of old age and natural causes and get replaced by other people. Case in point, Harold Westerling, that when he's already an old man with young Rhaenyra, when they skip ahead in the timeline 20 years to see adult Rhaenyra, he's just passed away. It's not a big event, they just mention it. So the very minor spoilers on that, I'll go over that this happened. If it was a murder mystery thing, I'd mention that. So the small council is made up of 7 major offices. Let me go through those in the early phase and the late phase, who's been cast and who hasn't, and what they might have changed. Makes sense to break that list of 7 down into 2 groups. There's the 3 special ones, and then there's the 4 that have the word Maester in the title. The 3 special ones, at the top are like the Hand of the King, who's the chief advisor, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, who serves for life and is the chief military advisor, the Grand Maester, who is not appointed by the king, but elected by the conclave of the Archmaesters as their representative to the small council. So there's those 3 positions. Then you have the 4 with Maester in the title: Master of Coin, Master of Laws, Master of Ships, and Master of Whisperers. That's Master of Spies, the Spy Master. Early in Viserys' reign, what we know of who was filling these offices is there was Hand of the King Otto Hightower, Alicent's father. Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was Harold Westerling. The Grand Maester was a man named Runciter. He preceded Mellos. Then the Master of Coin was Lyman Beesbury. Master of Laws, as we said, is Lionel Strong, who they just cast. And yes, like for the first year, Daemon played around in that position. He didn't really like it, but essentially, from near the beginning, it's been Lionel Strong. As for the last 2 positions, Master of Ships and Spy Master, the books don't say who was holding those positions in the early phase of Viserys' reign. Just a blank space there. Now there's 2 big sets of dates that you need to remember for how things shifted to the late phase. First one is with the Hand of the King. Viserys became king in the year 103 after conquest. AC, after conquest. 6 years later, in 109 AC, Otto had been pestering him for a marriage alliance between Rhaenyra and his grandson Aegon II so much that even Viserys got annoyed by it. So Viserys fired Otto and replaced him with Lionel Strong. So the year 109, Otto gets kicked out, and Lionel Strong gets promoted from Master of Laws to Hand of the King. Then, I'm not going to go into this too much, in the year 120 AC, right after Laena and Laenor Velaryon's funeral, which we saw them filming in spy photos, there was a mysterious fire in which Lionel and Harwin died. And it's a situation where half a dozen people had half a dozen different reasons to kill them, So it is a murder mystery of who could have killed them and why. I personally think the younger son, Larry Strong, did it. But that's a whole other discussion. So after Lionel died in 120, Otto Hightower was reinstated. He was brought back in to replace his replacement. So, Hand of the King, there's 3 phases actually. First, Otto Hightower, then in 109 to 120, Lionel Strong, then 120 to 129, Otto Hightower again. But these are the same men, just shifting positions back and forth. The other thing you need to keep track of for 2 characters, the Lord Commander of the King's Guard and the Grand Maester, Harold and Runciter actually both died in the same year, the year 112, of natural causes. Harold, as we know, was replaced by Kristen Cole, who they've already cast as Fabian Frankel, and Runciter was replaced by Mellos, who they've just announced in the cast here. So there's a question of, will they expand on this or condense this timeline-wise so that Harold is alive for a bit longer? Or might they condense Runciter and Mellos into one character? I actually think neither of these is a bad idea. But just, we have to keep track of this. That they might be filming, we know they're probably filming young Rhaenyra around the time her mother dies in the year 106. Rhaenyra then married Laenor as an arranged marriage in the year 114, which is after Harold died. Now, we saw them together. That might be an earlier scene around the same time that her mother died, and within a year her father remarried to Alicent. So nothing contradicting this yet. I don't think anyone have a problem with this. Graham McTavish is a great actor. We'd like to see him as Harold Westerling a bit more. But it does affect the core plot point of Kristen Cole rising to be Lord Commander, his rivalry with everyone else, and turning on Rhaenyra over time, and then at the wedding tournament with Laenor, he's in this black rage and he kills a man in the tournament. And it really sours relations between the 2 parties at court. So changing the date that Harold dies would affect some plot lines, not necessarily in a bad way. We haven't seen evidence that they're going to change it. Even if they do, it wouldn't be a problem. I'd like to see Graham McTavish in the show more. So they might push back the date of Harold's death a bit. Another question is if they'll merge Runciter and Mellos into one character. I think what's most probable is that they won't cast Runciter, but they won't merge him as a character, that they'll mention him in dialogue in the early scenes with young Rhaenyra. But so as not to confuse a new audience, the first time you see a Grand Maester on screen, it'll be Mellos. And he'll mention, oh yeah, I just replaced Runciter. That's probably what they're going to do. And we don't need to see Runciter. He's not that big of a character in this. It would be weird if they merged that or played around with the timelines. We'll see. And this is more of an open question. I don't have an answer, and I can't. There's really nothing more I can say. Because we know they need to age up the younger characters. You can't have people marrying at 13 or in a relationship with Kristen Cole. Because, I know the whole it's a medieval world, they start out younger, I get that. That legally they need to age up young Rhaenyra, young Alicent, even young Aegon II. And this will have ripple effects on who is on the small council when. And dates are just numbers. They can make those longer. It's more a question of, will Harold be alive by the time of Rhaenyra's wedding to Laenor? Mellos, of course, is the one who really championed the idea of we need to heal the rift with the Velaryons. Let's have an arranged marriage between Rhaenyra and Laenor. But he joined a couple of years earlier in 109. Then they had the arranged marriage 5 years later. That makes sense. So keep an eye on that. If Harold lives a little longer, how they're going to juggle Mellos with Runciter. Now we get to the list of who was on the small council late in the reign. I already covered throughout the whole thing. There was Otto, then Lionel, then Otto. There was Harold, then Kristen. Grand Maester is a little different, going through the 2 halves here. That it was mostly Runciter really early on, then mostly Mellos for the core of this, for Rhaenyra's wedding, through Laena's funeral, right before Viserys died, like 2 to 3 years before he died. Mellos died of old age, and he was replaced by a new Grand Maester, Orwyl. And this is a whole plot point. This would be a subplot, hopefully, that Rhaenyra and Alicent have their own private picks that they're pushing to be Grand Maester, and Viserys goes, look, I don't even pick the Grand Maester, the Conclave does, I'm not allowed to influence their decision. So Orwell is politically neutral, but there's this whole thing that they try to get someone to be Grand Maester, stacking the positions like that. The fact that they haven't cast Orwell means, maybe they're not going all the way to the start of the war by the end of season 1, or they might just not have announced him yet. So that's what I'm talking about, the things to keep an eye on of people who would appear right at the end like that. I mean, what about the younger characters? Like, we know from spy photos that a young Aemond has been cast, because we've seen the beach scene where he claims Vagar, which happened at Laena's funeral. The Civil War doesn't break out until 10 years after that, and we have heard nothing about casting an adult Aemon, by which I mean like a 20-year-old. We haven't heard that, which leads me to suspect that this won't happen until the end of Season 2, and I want them to take the time to set this up right. Now, I said the small council is in 2 halves. It's really 2 groups of 3, because Lyman Beesbury stays Master of Coin from beginning to end. He was in it a few years before Viserys even became king. So it's really 2 groups of 3, that out of 7, that one we don't need to worry about. He was always Master of Coin. And I already covered Hand, Lord Commander, Grand Maester. Well, who were the 3 people in these positions by the very end of Viserys' reign? Upon his death, we know who the 3 people were from the council that gathered then. At the end of his reign, the Master of Ships was Tywin Lannister, first Lannister on the Small Council. The Master of Spies was Larry Clubfoot Strong, and the Master of Laws was a man named Jasper Wilde, nicknamed Iron Rod because he was this strict legalist. House Wilde is from the Stormlands, and he was this strict legalist who firmly believed Andal succession law says that a younger son always comes ahead of an older daughter. Aegon II should succeed ahead of Rhaenyra. The one nice thing you can say is that the Hightowers do not believe in law. They are cynically trying to advance their own political interests. Iron Rod genuinely believes that. He genuinely believes in the law. That even when pressed, he just honestly thinks Aegon II should be the heir. This is what the law is. Even though royal succession law could be different, that Viserys had everyone take oaths that no, Rhaenyra is the heir. But, it's like stacking the Supreme Court with a really conservative guy. The conservative guy genuinely believes in what he's saying. It's not for politics, but he was picked by cynical people acting in their own self-interest. So Otto Hightower, when he was reinstated, apparently put Iron Rod on the small council because he would support that a son comes ahead of a daughter no matter what. So we know that eventually Tywin, Larry Clubfoot, and Iron Rod join the small council. The question is when. Now, for the first 2, it could have happened at any time, but I'd be surprised if they were appointed early on before the rift between the Blacks and the Greens really got underway. And from 109 to 120, Lionel Strong was in charge. Why would he appoint them? These really strong Otto Hightower loyalists. So it makes more sense to me that they don't spell this out, but the impression you get is that after Otto came back to power as Hand of the King in the year 120, he spent the next decade, he spent the 120s stacking the small council with these 3 new guys. That the Lannisters were staunch allies of the Hightowers, core members of the Greens, Alicent's faction, so they gave the Lannisters their first small council seat. Larry Clubfoot, you do not get the impression that he was on the small council before his father died, that his father would appoint his own son as spy master. You get the impression that this was some intrigue that he got on after that. And specifically when it comes to Master of Laws, there's a question of, okay, when Lionel got promoted to Hand in 109, did Iron Rod immediately succeed him? I don't get that impression. I get someone who's a strict legalist conservative like Iron Rod. That's someone Otto would have put in after he got reinstated, because the man is so blatantly a loyalist, a legal conservative. So there must have been an intervening Master of Laws under Lionel, who he when he got promoted, he appointed his own replacement in his lower position, who must have then got kicked out by Otto when he was reinstated and replaced with Ironrod. So the reason I'm setting all this up is we know they filmed through Laena's funeral in the year 120, and there's a question of, it's not padding, but it's a question of we don't want them to then just do a 10-year time skip and skip a decade of development for these characters. We don't want them to rush it like they did the second half of Game of Thrones. So, in sitting down on book forums, even among book fans for the prequel novellas, we've been discussing what could they do in the 120s, because not that much of the Rogue Prince novella really covers that. I mean, they mention things for specific characters. Well, one of the big through plots is leading up to the Civil War, Otto stacking the small council and gradually gaining more power there. That it points out, it doesn't talk about those three in detail, but for Grand Maester, it does point out there was this whole debate of Rhaenyra and Alicent were trying to get their candidate to be Grand Maester, and at best, they were able to force a neutral result. They picked a neutral guy. You get the impression the 120s were filled with the court debates over stacking the small council and court intrigue between Rhaenyra's faction and Alicent's faction centered around that. Meanwhile, what else could a second season do? I think a lot of it will be rounding out the Lannister and Stark characters, because these are popular families. I mean, obviously, Tywin Lannister is the main Lannister character, so a small council subplot would revolve around... It's not like, oh, why would we care about the small council? Because the Lannister main character is in it. I think people would watch that. And other stuff they could do with, like, Cregan Stark fighting his uncle in the north who tried to usurp him, Jane Arryn having her own succession war in the Vale, along with the succession crisis for the Velaryons, where Vaemond and the Silent Five outright accuse that Rhaenyra's sons are bastards, and Daemon takes care of that. And just continue the fighting in the Stepstones subplot, fighting the Free Cities there. So now, I wouldn't call this padding, it's just a point where the source material does a time skip. Maybe we should fill that in chronologically, the 120s, where one of the main plot lines was stacking the small council. And we haven't seen Ironrod yet. We haven't seen Orwell. And as for these other characters, I mean, the casting description for Tyland and Clubfoot, they don't describe them as small council members yet, though of course they describe them as their status in episode 1, so they don't want to give spoilers for that, because that happens later. All this ties into the question of when will season 1 end? I am not rooting for the Civil War to begin at the end of season 1. I don't want to skip a decade of character development, particularly because, if you haven't thought of this, it would skip over so much development of Rhaenyra and Alicent's children. This season is about Rhaenyra and Alicent. Next season, we need to be building up the Lannisters and the Small Council, the Starks, and some character development for Rhaenyra's sons, and with Aegon II stuff and Aemon One Eye, and you can see them building that up. I mean, beyond season 2, it would be absurd, though. We need the Civil War by season 3, or even late season 2. But how much of the story is going to extend into season 2 to tell it right? Because we don't want them to rush this. So this is one of the things we're paying attention to when we see casting announcements like this. Of, okay, there's Mellos, but there isn't Runsiter. He might simply be mentioned but not appear on screen. There's Harold Westerling. He'll be in some of the earlier parts. We saw leaks of clappers, the thing they yell action and then hit the thing and it says what the episode is. We know that at least the Rhaenyra and Laenor on a beach scenes with young Rhaenyra, those are in episode 5. Though the big question is, are they going to intercut extensive flashbacks, which a lot of people say, I've seen every channel saying that's too confusing. We'd rather they tell the story chronologically and have a time shift, so that by like episode 5, mid-episode 5 or episode 6, they transition from the younger characters to the older cast without flashbacks. That'd be needlessly confusing, and there's so much time they need to cover, so much extensive material, it wouldn't make sense as just a short flashback. So, in and of itself, the fact that there's a young Rhaenyra scene in episode 5, that doesn't tell us anything. Is it a flashback? Or are they covering everything through her marriage in 5 episodes? And then the next 5 are the events leading up to the deaths of Laena and Laenor. Would we then skip the 120s or not and the big small council subplot? We don't know. So please keep checking back. I am buried in spy reports. There's a huge tournament set they built in Surrey where they're going to be filming this week, where we hope to get a lot more spy photos showing exactly when does everything happen. We're really hoping to see the tournament held in honor of the wedding of Rhaenyra and Laenor, and if Harold Westerling is in the crowd or not, that'll answer that question. So keep checking back, like and subscribe. There's a lot of news coming out.